Hello, my name is Mike, and today we're building a nonlinear circuits triple sloths from a kit. Before I started making videos, I had previously built 4 surface mount component modules from kits, a nonlinear circuits divide and conquer clock divider, a Ripples 1.0 filter, a micro Ornament Crime, and a rings. The rings ended up being a bit of a disaster. I messed up the kit so bad that I basically ended up building a second module from scratch, and at the end of the day I spent about as much money as I would have on a brand new mutable instruments rings module at the time. It's been 2.5 years since I built my rings, so it's been a while since I've done a surface mount component build. Working with surface mount is a bit different from through-hole. You do need some additional tools. First of all, a good pair of tweezers helps with handling the tiny components. You want to make sure they are not magnetic. Even lightly magnetized tweezers will cause endless frustration. You're also going to need flux. Flux is a chemical that makes solder flow better, and it seems to attract the solder to metal. This is essential when working with surface mount, as you want to guarantee the solder flows underneath the components and forms a bond between the pad on the PCB and the contact points of the components. I like to use a no-clean flux pen, but there are many different options for flux available. Here is a water-soluble flux pen. I just don't like the idea of using water on circuit boards, but apparently that's a thing and it's no big deal. Some people prefer to clean the flux off their circuit boards, but I've never had a problem using the no-clean stuff. Now, because we're using flux, we're going to want a fan. I don't mind the smell of solder, but flux is terrible in terms of smell, and it can even cause headaches and nausea sometimes. It's also a good idea to have other fans running throughout your work area to get all that nastiness outside ASAP. If you make mistakes, a solder sucker won't help with the SMD components. You'll need a copper braid and plenty of flux. In fact, my advice is, don't make mistakes. It's easier that way. Sometimes, especially with cheap PCBs, you can ruin them using copper braid. It will tear the masking right off. Typically, these are PCBs that have a paper-like texture. And since we're dealing with such small components, having some magnification handy is helpful. I have this whole headgear visor thing. I hate this, I don't like wearing it, and I wear glasses, so it doesn't really work for me. I get by just using a cheap magnifying glass that I ordered online. I don't do builds with 0402 sized components. I'm never going to try it. I just won't even bother. The nonlinear circuit stuff is usually 0805, which is great. I find that pretty comfortable to work with. When I did rings, that was 0604, and that is my limit for how small I will go. Maybe in a few weeks I'll be doing another 0604 module, but today we're going to start out with the nonlinear circuits triple sloths. If you want to dip a toe in SMD, I think the nonlinear circuits kits are great. I highly recommend doing a couple of these before you go off into the world of building mutable instruments clones and whatnot. As always, this video is not sponsored. I bought this kit with my own money, and the background music to this video was made using the nonlinear circuits triple sloths. Another thing we might want to do, use a smaller cone-shaped soldering iron tip instead of the chisel-shaped one I have been using. This way I have a smaller tip to make contact with the smaller contact pads. The entire module fits on one circuit board. With SMD, generally the strategy is to start in the middle and work outward. It's just a matter of having room. The great thing about NLC is they don't use those crazy 32 or 64 leg microprocessor chips. The ICs are very manageable, so we'll do ICs first and then move on to resistors and capacitors and everything else. I'm sorting the components to separate the resistors and capacitors and front panel hardware from everything else. The values are printed on the board, so we don't have to worry so much about the C1, C2, etc. designations. We have 8-legged ICs and 14-legged ICs. And I forgot to hit record. I've already done the 14-legged ICs. Now I'm starting the 8-legged ICs. What I do is I solder one corner pad, then with a pair of tweezers, I place the IC so that the 8 pins are touching the 8 corresponding pads. And then I press the iron against the soldered pad and push the leg into it. I'm using the solder that I already put there to make the connection. These contacts are very small, so I don't need a lot of solder, and it's very easy to use too much solder with surface mount components. You can see where it's misaligned, so I go in with the soldering iron again, melt the solder, and use the tweezers to nudge that IC back into place. Now I apply flux to the legs, which helps the solder flow across the pad and underneath the legs, creating a better connection. Now I attempt the drag technique to the legs, where I drag solder from one leg to the next, but it isn't really necessary here, and it's not really working. For the 8-legged ICs, I'm just better off soldering one leg at a time. The drag technique makes more sense when you have more legs and they're closer together. The first side looks great, but this other side has what I describe as solder boogers. So I add some flux and hit them again to try and smooth it all out. The flux magically sucks solder towards the metal. My next IC is right there, but I've got a 100K resistor between that and this other IC, so I want to care for that first while I have open access to get at it. I need to find the bag of 100K resistors. This is a 68 million ohm resistor. I never knew such a thing existed. And now there's a 100 million ohm resistor. These don't even sound like real numbers. I found the bag of 100K resistors. See how tiny these are compared to my thumb. I just want to pull up enough plastic to only release one. These are 0805. As far as SMD components go, these are the bigger ones. I make a mistake here. I should have only applied solder to one of the two pads, but I soldered both. This means the resistor is raised up on top of the solder of the side I'm not touching with the iron, making it very difficult to get the resistor down flat all the way. I realize my error and start applying flux and heating the pads while pushing down with the tweezers. Things get worse before they get better. I start alternating between the two sides in an attempt to get both of them flowing. Sometimes this works when you need to pull a soldered component off the board. This is about the best it's going to get. I use a multimeter to test to make sure this will work, and it looks like it will. I'm getting readings from one side of the resistor to the next pad the other side of the resistor is connected to. Worst comes to worst, I do have a reflow station heat gun type of thing that I can use if that's needed. Now I'm proceeding with the second of the two 8-legged ICs. I'm seeing markings that say 1V and 10V, and I'm confused. I'm not sure what components these are referring to. I'm also seeing markings that say RL. Time to take a break and do some research. I'm back, and those markings don't say 1V and 10V, they say 1U and 10U, as in UF or microfarads. Those are our capacitors. Now I'm demonstrating the correct way to solder components by only applying solder to one of the two pads. I place and solder the component, in this case a capacitor, and then I solder the other side. I will repeat this over and over again, generously applying lots of flux to ensure the solder flows evenly and forms a strong connection. It is very easy to use too much solder when working with such small components. I don't know how it happens, but it seems like these tweezers have suddenly become magnetized. Shortly, I'll dig out a demagnetizer and switch to a different set of tweezers. You'll see I'm methodically working my way from the center outwards towards the edges and corners. So it turns out RL refers to a set of 3 resistors, which are variable depending on the color of the LEDs. In this case, my kit came with 2.2 k ohm resistors that correspond to red-green LEDs. It's a bit confusing because the BOM says 470 ohms. I used what came with my kit and everything works fine. You'll see that there are only 2 4M7 resistors needed for this build, but there's an extra third one provided. With surface mount kits, in my experience, it's not uncommon to get one extra of each component, just in case one is missing or dropped or you lose it or anything like that. I will save these extra components in their plastic bags and eventually consolidate all the ones that are the same value and size, just in case I ever need them later on for another build. Right here, I accidentally get solder in that tiny little hole called a via next to the 4M7 resistor. At first, I try to unclog it using a solder sucker, but after looking it over carefully, it appears that it's touching the 4M7 resistor, so I decide to just leave it be. Alright, now I have my magnetizer / demagnetizer. This part is the magnetizer. This part is the demagnetizer. I don't want magnetization on my tweezers, and since I have this, I might as well switch to my angled tweezers and demagnetize those. Now that I've confirmed the RL resistor values are okay, I do those next. Now we're doing diodes 1 and 2. These diodes have a stripe on one side, and that stripe must be on the same side as the stripe with the arrow pointing to it printed on the PCB. These two diodes face opposite directions. Next up, we have what the PCB has labeled as Schottky diodes, but the baggie that came with the kit calls them S1JL rectifiers. These are also polarized. The side of the rectifier with a line must be oriented to the dot printed on the PCB. And now we're finished with the surface mount components. Going forward, we're just doing the front panel hardware, Minijacks, LEDs, and potentiometers. Oh, and I almost forgot to add the power pin header, so I'm doing that now. LEDs are polarized. The long leg must go into the hole marked positive. After placing the first potentiometer, I remember we want to remove all the nuts and washers. I start screwing the nuts in for the corner mini jacks and pots, but I realize that there are these tiny little metal nubs on the potentiometers that are causing the front panel to have a bit of a slant from bottom to top, so I'm going to need to carefully cut those off. I don't want to use my good wire cutters for this, so I dig out an older, clunkier one. Now it's lying nice and flat. First, I want to solder the LEDs so I can trim their legs out of the way. It is important that as you solder the LEDs in place, you make sure that they remain properly aligned with the front hole on the panel. As I begin soldering in the mini jacks, I notice some legs of one of the ICs look like they might need a little bit more solder. When it comes to the potentiometers, I'm just going to solder the main 3 pins just in case anything doesn't work. I'll hold off on soldering the location lugs until after I confirm the module is working. Finally, I'm going to check the continuity of the power pins to make sure there isn't a short before I plug it in and test it. Alright, here we are with the triple sloths. We have power hooked up. Let's go ahead, turn it on. It's the puff of white smoke test. So far, so good. Anything? No lights. Oh, there's a light. Got one. So I think I'm testing it. I want it all the way up. Let's get an oscillator going here while we're waiting. Oh, I just saw something on the right. There we go. This cable's too short. Let's find a longer cable. That's fun. Over here we got inertia. There we got apathy. Well, that's fun. Yeah. It's all just a bunch of different slow moving looking good. Now that we know the module works, we're going to solder the location lugs on the potentiometers, put the knobs on, and then we're done. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, please consider liking and subscribing. Have a great day.